I never thought my own parents would choose money over my life. But 3 years ago, they proved me wrong when they refused to help with my $32,000 emergency surgery that nearly killed me. I had to sell everything I owned, drain my savings, and take crushing loans just to survive. Now they have the audacity to demand I hand over $55,000 for my spoiled sister's dream wedding because suddenly, family comes first. When I said no, all hell broke loose. 3 years ago, I was 25 and living what I thought was my dream life. I had just landed my first major role as a software developer at a promising tech startup in Austin, Texas. The salary was decent. The work environment was everything I had hoped for, and I finally felt like all those late nights studying computer science were paying off. It was a Tuesday morning in September when my world came crashing down. I was presenting our latest application update to a room full of investors when a sharp pain suddenly tore through my abdomen like someone had stabbed me with a white-hot knife. The pain was so intense that I doubled over mid-sentence, gasping for air as the conference room spun around me. My colleague Jake rushed me to the emergency room at St. David's Medical Center. By the time we arrived, I was barely conscious. My skin had turned a sickly gray color, and my temperature was spiking dangerously high. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Martinez, took one look at me and immediately ordered a CT scan. The results were terrifying. My appendix had not only burst, but had been leaking infected material into my abdominal cavity for hours. What should have been a routine appendectomy had become a life-threatening case of peritonitis. Dr. Martinez explained that I needed immediate surgery followed by at least a week in the hospital on powerful antibiotics to fight the infection that was spreading through my body. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I managed to call my parents. My father, Frank, answered on the third ring, his voice gruff and impatient as always. When I explained the situation through gritted teeth, fighting waves of nausea and pain, his response was nothing like what I expected from a father whose son was facing emergency surgery. Instead of rushing to the hospital, Frank's immediate concern was the cost. He demanded to know how much the surgery would cost, whether I had insurance, and why I was calling them about it. When I explained that my insurance would only cover about 60% of the estimated $32,000 bill, leaving me responsible for nearly $13,000 that I simply did not have, his reaction was ice cold. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When I woke up in the recovery room groggy and stitched up from hip to hip, I found my girlfriend Sarah sitting beside my bed. She was still wearing her scrubs from her shift at the pediatric clinic where she worked as a nurse. Her eyes were red from crying, and she was holding my hand like she was afraid I might disappear. My parents finally showed up the next day. They stayed exactly 10 minutes, just long enough for my mother Carol to comment on how expensive the private room was, and for Frank to lecture me about the importance of having better insurance coverage. When the hospital's billing coordinator approached them to discuss payment options, they literally walked away, leaving me lying there with tubes still coming out of my abdomen. Sarah witnessed the entire exchange. She later told me she had never seen anything so cold in her entire nursing career, and she had worked with families facing terminal diagnoses who showed more compassion than my own parents displayed during my medical emergency. The real slap in the face came 2 days later when I was scrolling through Facebook from my hospital bed, trying to distract myself from the pain. There, posted just 6 hours after they had walked away from my bedside, was a photo of my parents standing next to a brand new $40,000 luxury RV. The caption read, "Finally pulled the trigger on our dream vacation home. Time to see America, in style." They had purchased a recreational vehicle worth more than my entire medical bill on the same day they claimed they were too financially strapped to help their son avoid bankruptcy from emergency surgery. The timing was not coincidental. It was a deliberate message about where their priorities lay. The financial devastation that followed my surgery was more painful than the physical recovery. I had worked so hard to build a stable foundation for my adult life, and within a matter of weeks it all crumbled beneath medical bills that kept arriving in the mail like a constant reminder of my family's abandonment. My beloved Honda Civic was the first thing to go. I had saved for 2 years to buy that car, working part-time jobs throughout college, and putting aside every spare dollar. It was not fancy or flashy, but it was mine, and it represented my independence and hard work. Selling it to a used car dealer for $8,000 felt like giving away a piece of my identity. Next went my emergency fund, $15,000 that I had carefully accumulated over 3 years of disciplined saving. Money that was supposed to protect me from exactly this kind of crisis disappeared in a single transaction to the hospital billing department. Watching my bank account balance drop to double digits was terrifying in a way I had never experienced before. But even liquidating everything I owned was not enough. I still owed nearly $9,000 in medical expenses, and the high-interest payment plans offered by the hospital would have stretched the debt out for years while accumulating even more costs. I had no choice but to take out personal loans with interest rates that made my stomach turn. Sarah watched me transform from a confident young professional into someone who calculated the cost of every grocery item and walked 3 miles to work each day to save on bus fare. I was working my regular 40-hour week at the startup, then coming home to freelance coding projects that kept me up until 2 in the morning. Weekends became another opportunity to pick up contract work rather than time to rest and recover. The psychological toll was devastating. I developed anxiety attacks that would hit me without warning, usually triggered by unexpected expenses like a car repair bill or a higher-than-expected utility payment. I started seeing a therapist, but even that was a luxury I could barely afford, so I limited myself to 1 session per month instead of the weekly appointment she recommended. During this entire period, my parents continued living their lavish lifestyle without any apparent concern for my struggles. Their social media accounts became a constant source of pain, as I watched them post photos from expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to Napa Valley, and shopping trips where Carol would show off designer handbags that cost more than my monthly rent. The cruelest irony came 4 months after my surgery when Madison, my 24-year-old sister, received a brand new BMW for her birthday. The car was worth at least $35,000, and my parents presented it to her with a giant red bow in our childhood driveway. Madison had never held a steady job for more than 6 months, had dropped out of college twice, and was living at home rent-free, while pursuing what she called her artistic journey of making jewelry that she sold occasionally at local craft fairs. I learned about the car through a cheerful text message from Madison, complete with photos of her posing beside her new vehicle. She added a casual, "Hope you're feeling better from your surgery" thing, as if my near-death experience and subsequent financial ruin were equivalent to recovering from a common cold. My living situation became another casualty of the medical debt. The comfortable 1-bedroom apartment I had rented in a safe neighborhood near downtown Austin was no longer affordable. I moved to a studio apartment in a rougher part of town where the rent was $300 cheaper per month, but where I heard gunshots occasionally and had to park my replacement bicycle inside to prevent theft. Mrs. Patterson, my 78-year-old neighbor in the new building, became an unexpected source of comfort during this dark period. She was a retired school teacher who had raised 5 children on her own after her husband died in Vietnam. She would invite me over for dinner once a week, always making extra food and pretending she needed help, finishing leftovers so I would not feel like I was accepting charity. Through quiet conversations over her homemade pot roast and mashed potatoes, Mrs. Patterson helped me understand that my parents' behavior was not normal or acceptable. She had lived through the Great Depression as a child and understood financial hardship, but she could not comprehend parents who would abandon their child during a medical crisis while spending money on luxury items. The breaking point came 8 months after my surgery when I discovered the full extent of my parents' deception. I was at a family friend's barbecue, one of the few social events I could still afford to attend since it was free food, when Mrs. Henderson, who had known our family for 20 years, approached me with sympathy in her eyes. She told me how proud she was of my independence and maturity in handling my medical crisis without burdening my parents financially. According to her, Frank and Carol had explained to everyone in their social circle that I was too proud to accept help, and that they were respecting my independence by not forcing assistance on me. My parents had completely fabricated the story of my refusal to accept help, painting themselves as supportive parents who were honoring their son's desire for self-sufficiency. They had turned my abandonment into a virtue story about raising an independent child while privately continuing to live their luxurious lifestyle without any concern for my actual well-being. That night I called Sarah and told her everything Mrs. Henderson had revealed. Sarah had been my anchor through the entire ordeal, working extra shifts to help cover groceries, and never once complaining about the dramatic change in our lifestyle. She cried when I told her about my parents' lies, not because she was surprised by their behavior, but because she was heartbroken that any family could treat their child with such calculated cruelty. The next 2 years became a testament to human resilience and the power of determination, fueled by righteous anger. Every dollar I earned above my basic survival needs went toward paying off the medical debt that had nearly destroyed my life. I was not just recovering financially, I was proving to myself and everyone else that I could rebuild something even stronger than what my parents' abandonment had torn down. My boss Tom at the startup noticed my work ethic and dedication during those brutal months when I was taking on every extra project available. While other employees complained about tight deadlines or difficult clients, I embraced every opportunity to earn additional income. Tom later told me that he had never seen someone so focused and driven, and when a senior developer position opened up 18 months after my surgery, he promoted me without hesitation. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase that finally allowed me to breathe financially. For the first time since my medical crisis, I could afford to eat something other than ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. I could buy new clothes to replace the ones that had become too big as I lost weight from stress and poor nutrition. Most importantly, I could accelerate my debt payments and see a realistic path toward financial freedom. Sarah and I had grown closer through the hardship rather than letting it drive us apart. She had seen me at my lowest point, watching me cry from stress and exhaustion, helping me calculate payment plans late into the night, and never once suggesting that my family's behavior was normal or acceptable. Her unwavering support taught me what real love looked like in contrast to the conditional affection I had experienced from my parents. 6 months ago, I finally worked up the courage to propose to Sarah. I could not afford the kind of elaborate proposal that social media had taught us to expect, but I made it personal and meaningful. I took her back to Mrs. Patterson's apartment, where the elderly woman had agreed to cook her famous pot roast one more time. After dinner, I got down on one knee in the tiny living room that had been a sanctuary during my darkest period and asked Sarah to marry me. The engagement ring was modest, but chosen with care. I had saved for 4 months to buy it, and while it was not the largest diamond in the jewelry store, it represented something more valuable than money could buy: the promise of a partnership built on mutual support and genuine love, rather than financial transactions and conditional approval. My parents' reaction to our engagement announcement was predictably self-centered. Carol immediately began asking about wedding plans, venue selections, and guest lists without ever offering congratulations or expressing happiness for our relationship. Frank's primary concern was whether I expected them to contribute financially to the wedding, a question that would have been laughable if it were not so insulting. During this same period, Madison continued her pattern of expensive demands and parental indulgence. She had dropped out of her 3rd college program, this time abandoning a communications degree just 12 credits short of graduation, because she decided the professors did not understand her creative vision. Instead of encouraging her to finish her education, my parents funded an expensive trip to Europe so Madison could find herself through travel. The photographs from Madison's European adventure filled social media for months. Designer hotel rooms in Paris, private wine tastings in Tuscany, shopping sprees in Milan where single handbags cost more than my monthly salary. Each image was a reminder of the vast difference in how my parents treated their 2 children, and the casual way Madison accepted their generosity as her natural right. I maintained minimal contact with my family during this rebuilding period, attending only Christmas and Easter celebrations with the detached politeness of a distant acquaintance. Conversations were superficial and brief, focused on safe topics like weather or current events, rather than anything personal or meaningful. My parents seemed content with this arrangement, never acknowledging the elephant in the room or showing any curiosity about my recovery from their abandonment. The real estate market in Austin was competitive, but with my improved income and steadily rising credit score, I qualified for a modest mortgage on a small house in a decent neighborhood. The three-bedroom ranch-style home was nothing fancy, but it had a fenced backyard, updated appliances, and, most importantly, it was mine. Linda, my real estate agent, had worked extra hard to help me navigate the buying process despite my previous credit issues, and she became another person in my chosen family of supporters. Moving into that house felt like a symbolic victory over everything that had tried to destroy me. Sarah and I painted the walls together, planted a garden in the backyard, and slowly furnished each room with pieces we selected together. It was the first space I had ever owned where every decision was mine, where no landlord could kick me out, and where my parents' opinions or approval were completely irrelevant. My financial advisor, Robert, helped me create a comprehensive plan for long-term security that went far beyond just paying off medical debt. We established an emergency fund that was larger than my previous one, set up retirement accounts that would compound over time, and created investment strategies that would build wealth rather than just covering expenses. Robert's guidance taught me that true financial independence was not just about surviving crisis, but about creating systems that could weather any future storms. The final medical bill payment was made on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years and 7 months after my surgery. I sat in my car outside the hospital billing office holding the cashier's check that would close the last account and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also pride in having accomplished something that had seemed impossible during those dark months of recovery. But the real test of my growth came 3 weeks later at my engagement party, a casual backyard barbecue at Sarah's parents' house. Her family had embraced me completely, treating me like a son rather than an in-law, and their genuine warmth highlighted the dysfunction of my own family relationships. Sarah's father, Bill, had spent the afternoon teaching me how to properly grill barbecue ribs, while her mother, Jennifer, shared family recipes and stories about Sarah's childhood. My parents arrived late to the engagement party, making a grand entrance that drew attention away from the guests who were actually celebrating Sarah and me. Carol was wearing a new designer dress that probably cost more than our entire party budget, while Frank immediately began dominating conversations with stories about their recent business successes and vacation plans. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed my parents having whispered conversations with each other, glancing in my direction, with expressions I could not quite read. Finally, as other guests were beginning to leave and Sarah was inside, helping with cleanup, Frank and Carol cornered me beside the garden shed where no one else could hear our conversation. The words that came out of Frank's mouth hit me like a physical blow. He told me it was time to stop holding grudges and step up as the responsible son, because Madison needed my help with her upcoming wedding expenses. According to Frank, they had already promised Madison a $55,000 dream wedding, but unexpected business costs meant they were short on funds and needed me to cover the difference. The audacity was breathtaking. The same parents who had abandoned me during a life-threatening medical emergency, who had lied to family friends about my situation, who had spent the equivalent of my medical bills on luxury items while I ate ramen noodles and worked multiple jobs, were now demanding that I fund their spoiled daughter's extravagant wedding. When I stood there in stunned silence, Carol jumped in with her specialty, emotional manipulation, disguised as maternal concern. She talked about family unity, about how weddings were once-in-a-lifetime events, about how successful I had become, and how I should be grateful for the strong work ethic they had instilled in me through tough love. She actually used the phrase tough love to describe abandoning me during emergency surgery. The engagement party that should have been a celebration of Sarah's and my future together ended with me learning that my family's dysfunction was far from over. As I watched my parents drive away in Frank's luxury truck, I realized that the financial crisis from my surgery had been just the beginning of a much larger battle for my independence and self-respect. Madison's wedding planning had apparently been in full swing for months, though I had been deliberately excluded from all discussions and decisions. The revelation came in the form of a glossy invitation that arrived in my mailbox 2 weeks after the engagement party confrontation. The invitation itself was a work of art printed on heavy cardstock with gold foil lettering and tissue paper inserts clearly expensive and meticulously designed. The wedding was scheduled for 6 months away at the Barton Creek Country Club, one of the most exclusive venues in Austin. I knew from my software development work with event planning companies that weekend weddings at Barton Creek started at $40,000 and could easily exceed $80,000 with all the premium options. The invitation listed Madison Elizabeth Thompson and Derek Michael Chen as the happy couple, though I had met Derek only twice in the past year. Derek was 26 years old and had never held what most people would consider a real job. He called himself a digital content creator and lifestyle influencer, which translated to taking photographs of expensive meals and luxury products for his Instagram account that had about 3,000 followers. He lived in a downtown apartment that his wealthy parents paid for while he pursued his social media dreams, apparently with no timeline for achieving actual profitability or independence. The confrontation with my parents escalated 3 days after I received the wedding invitation. They showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning while Sarah was at work, letting themselves into my backyard through the side gate, as if they owned the property. I found them examining my vegetable garden and discussing how much money I must be saving by growing my own food, a comment that felt both patronizing and completely missing the point of why people garden. Frank wasted no time with pleasantries. He had calculated exactly how much money I should be able to contribute to Madison's wedding, based on his assumptions about my income, my mortgage payments, and what he considered my reasonable living expenses. According to his analysis, $55,000 was not only affordable for me, but actually represented less than half of what I should be able to save each year. The mathematical precision of his demand was somehow more insulting than if he had just asked for help. He had clearly spent time researching software developer salaries, calculating my probable take-home pay, and determining what percentage of my income should be available for family obligations. It was the kind of detailed financial planning that had been completely absent when I needed help with medical bills. Carol's approach was more emotional, but equally manipulative. She talked about how Madison had dreamed of a perfect wedding since childhood, how important it was for young women to have fairy tale memories, and how family support during major life events created bonds that lasted forever. She conveniently omitted any mention of how their lack of support during my medical emergency had affected our family bonds. When I reminded them of the surgery situation and pointed out the hypocrisy of their current demands, Frank's response was volcanic. He accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and bitter. According to him, the medical emergency was completely different because it was my responsibility as an adult to handle my own healthcare costs. Madison's wedding, however, was a family celebration that required everyone to contribute according to their means. The logic was so twisted that I actually laughed, which made Frank even angrier. He began shouting about respect and family loyalty, his voice carrying across the neighborhood as he listed everything he claimed to have done for me over the years. The list was mostly fictional, including claims about paying for college expenses that I had actually covered with loans and scholarships, and supporting me during job searches that had lasted less than 2 weeks. Madison's tantrum was even more spectacular than her parents' demands. She arrived at my house an hour after they did, apparently summoned by frantic phone calls about my refusal to cooperate. At 24 years old, Madison threw herself into a screaming fit that would have been embarrassing coming from a toddler. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness out of jealousy and spite. She claimed that I had always resented her success and popularity, conveniently rewriting history to ignore the fact that her success consisted entirely of spending our parents' money while contributing nothing productive to society. She actually used the phrase, "You've always been jealous of how much Mom and Dad love me," without any apparent awareness of how that statement sounded. The threats began when emotional manipulation failed to work. Frank announced that if I did not contribute to Madison's wedding fund, they would boycott my own wedding to Sarah. Carol added that I would no longer be welcome at family holidays or gatherings. Madison went even further, threatening to tell extended family members that I was a selfish person who had abandoned the family after becoming successful. But the real shock came when I decided to do some investigation of my own. Patricia, the wedding coordinator at Barton Creek Country Club, was a former client from my freelance days who remembered me fondly. When I called her under the pretense of asking about venue options for my own wedding, she inadvertently revealed information that changed everything. According to Patricia, my parents had been making payments on Madison's wedding for 4 months, but they were significantly behind schedule. The total cost was approaching $75,000 once all the premium options were included, and the club was requiring full payment 6 weeks before the event. More importantly, Patricia mentioned that Frank and Carol had specifically told her that their son would be covering a large portion of the expenses, so they were not worried about the payment timeline. My parents had been promising Madison a lavish wedding based on money they expected to extract from me, apparently without ever asking if I was willing to contribute. They had created a financial obligation in my name without my knowledge or consent, then presented it to me as a family emergency that required immediate resolution. The unexpected business expenses that supposedly created their budget shortfall turned out to be even more insulting than I had imagined. Through casual social media investigation and conversations with family friends, I discovered that Frank and Carol had taken a $60,000 European cruise 3 months earlier, the same cruise that Madison had promoted heavily on her Instagram account, with photos of luxury accommodations and expensive shore excursions. During the same period, Carol had purchased a new BMW SUV to replace her previous luxury car, which had been only 2 years old and in perfect condition. The new vehicle cost approximately $50,000, meaning my parents had spent over $100,000 on personal luxuries while creating a budget crisis for their daughter's wedding expenses. The cruelest revelation came through Derek's social media accounts, which I had never bothered to examine closely before. He had been posting regularly about his future brother-in-law who was generously funding his dream wedding, taking credit for my supposed generosity and using it to enhance his own social media image. Derek had been telling his friends and followers that he was marrying into a close-knit, wealthy family, where successful siblings supported each other through major life events. Madison had been doing the same thing, posting about wedding plans while hinting broadly about family support and financial backing. She had created an entire narrative about having a generous brother who understood the importance of making her wedding day perfect, apparently believing that public pressure and social expectations would force me to comply with their demands. The situation reached a breaking point when Sarah came home from work to find me sitting in our kitchen, surrounded by printed screenshots and financial documents, trying to make sense of the web of lies and manipulation my family had created. Sarah took one look at the evidence and immediately understood what was happening. Her reaction was fierce and protective, in a way that made me fall in love with her all over again. She had watched my parents abandon me during my medical crisis, witnessed their lies and manipulation at family gatherings, and now she was seeing them try to financially exploit me for their own poor planning and irresponsible promises. That evening, Sarah and I made a decision that would change everything. We were not going to be victims of my family's dysfunction anymore. We were going to fight back with the truth, and we were going to make sure that everyone involved understood exactly what kind of people Frank and Carol really were. The declaration of war came in the form of a group text message that Frank sent to every member of our extended family at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. The message was carefully crafted to portray me as a selfish son who had abandoned family values after achieving financial success. According to Frank's version of events, I was refusing to help my sister during her time of need, despite having plenty of money to spare. Within hours, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been recruited into Frank and Carol's campaign. The messages ranged from disappointed lectures about family responsibility to outright accusations of greed and selfishness. Most of my relatives had no knowledge of my medical crisis 3 years earlier, so they had no context for understanding why I might be reluctant to hand over $55,000 to parents who had previously abandoned me. Aunt Helen, my mother's sister, left a particularly harsh voicemail calling me too big for my britches and suggesting that success had made me forget where I came from. Cousin Danny, who had borrowed money from me twice in college and never paid it back, sent a text message about the importance of family loyalty and helping those in need. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also effective in creating social pressure and family division. Madison's social media campaign was even more calculated and vicious. She began posting passive-aggressive content about fake family members who pretended to care, but disappeared when support was actually needed. She shared inspirational quotes about toxic people who needed to be cut out of your life for your own mental health. She even posted a tearful video about how wedding planning stress was affecting her emotional well-being, hinting broadly about family drama without mentioning specific details. The most painful part of Madison's campaign was how she weaponized our childhood memories against me. She posted old photographs of family vacations and holidays, adding captions about how things used to be before some people changed and became different. She shared a picture of us building a snowman together when we were kids, with a caption about how sad it was when siblings grew apart and stopped caring about each other's happiness. Sarah became collateral damage in the family warfare. Carol began making snide comments about Sarah's influence over me, suggesting that my girlfriend had turned me against my own family. According to Carol's narrative, I had been a loving and generous son until Sarah convinced me to prioritize my relationship over family obligations. The attacks on Sarah were particularly infuriating because she had been nothing but supportive and understanding throughout my family's dysfunction. Frank's strategy was more direct and aggressive. He started showing up at my workplace during lunch hours, waiting in the parking lot to ambush me with guilt trips and financial arguments. He would corner my coworkers and tell them about his ungrateful son who had forgotten his family after achieving success. My boss, Tom, was professional enough to avoid getting involved, but the situation was embarrassing and disruptive to my work environment. The psychological warfare extended to threats and ultimatums designed to force my compliance through fear of isolation. Carol announced that I would no longer receive Christmas or birthday gifts from the family if I did not contribute to Madison's wedding. Frank threatened to remove me from the family business succession plan, apparently forgetting that I had never wanted any involvement in his landscaping company and had built my own career in a completely different field. But the most serious threat came from Madison herself, who declared that my refusal to help would permanently damage our sibling relationship. She claimed that she would never be able to forgive me for ruining her dream wedding, and that she would make sure any future children she had would know about their uncle who had prioritized money over family love. The emotional blackmail was sophisticated and designed to prey on my desire to maintain some connection with my sister despite her entitled behavior. During this escalating conflict, I decided to conduct my own investigation into family finances and discover the full truth about my parents' claims of financial hardship. What I uncovered was a pattern of financial irresponsibility and deception that went far beyond the wedding crisis. Frank and Carol's landscaping business was actually thriving, with gross revenues that had increased substantially over the past 3 years. Their claims of business struggles were completely fabricated, designed to justify their inability to fund Madison's wedding after spending their available cash on personal luxuries. The European cruise, Carol's new BMW, Frank's luxury truck, and their ongoing expensive lifestyle had consumed the money that should have been saved for their daughter's wedding expenses. More disturbing was the discovery that my parents had been using Madison's wedding as leverage for months, telling various family members different stories about funding sources and financial responsibilities. They had asked my Uncle Pete for a loan, approached my grandparents about early inheritance advances, and even suggested that Sarah's parents should contribute to the wedding costs since they would be gaining a daughter-in-law from a prestigious family. The wedding vendors were beginning to pressure Madison directly for payment guarantees, creating stress and anxiety that my parents blamed on my refusal to help rather than taking responsibility for their own poor financial planning. Patricia from Barton Creek Country Club had started requiring weekly payment updates, and several vendors were threatening to cancel services if deposits were not received on schedule. Derek's response to the financial pressure revealed his true character and priorities. Instead of offering emotional support to his stressed fiancée or suggesting modifications to reduce wedding costs, Derek began questioning whether Madison's family was as wealthy and generous as they had claimed. He started making comments about downsizing the reception, reducing the guest list, or postponing the wedding until finances improved. Madison's world was crumbling under the weight of promises that had been made with money that did not exist, and instead of recognizing her parents' role in creating the crisis, she doubled down on blaming me for the family's problems. She convinced herself that my selfishness was the only obstacle preventing her dream wedding, and she recruited friends and extended family members to pressure me into compliance. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when I received a phone call from Derek's mother, Elizabeth, who had somehow gotten my contact information and wanted to discuss the wedding funding situation. Elizabeth was a successful real estate attorney who immediately saw through my parents' financial manipulation and poor planning. Instead of pressuring me to contribute money, she questioned why Frank and Carol had made commitments they could not afford and suggested that Madison needed to learn about realistic budgeting and financial responsibility. Elizabeth's perspective was refreshing and validating, but it also revealed another layer of dysfunction in the situation. Derek's parents had significant wealth and could easily afford to fund the entire wedding themselves, but they had deliberately chosen not to because they believed Madison and her family needed to demonstrate their own financial stability and commitment to the marriage. The irony was perfect. Derek's wealthy parents were refusing to pay for the wedding because they wanted to see evidence of financial responsibility from Madison's family, while Madison's parents were demanding money from me because they had spent their available funds on personal luxuries. Everyone was pointing fingers at everyone else, while the supposed bride and groom were caught in the middle of a financial crisis that had been completely avoidable. Uncle Pete emerged as the only voice of reason and support during this chaotic period. Pete was Frank's older brother, a retired veteran who had always been the most grounded and honest member of the family. He called me privately to say that he suspected there was more to the story than Frank and Carol were sharing, and he wanted to hear my side of the situation without family politics and manipulation. Uncle Pete's validation was emotionally significant because he had always been a respected authority figure in our family. His opinion carried weight with other relatives, and his willingness to question Frank and Carol's narrative gave me hope that not everyone would automatically accept their version of events. Pete had served 2 tours in Vietnam and had no patience for manipulation or dishonesty, especially when it involved exploiting family relationships for financial gain. The family war was escalating toward a confrontation that would force everyone to choose sides and reveal the truth about years of dysfunction and favoritism. Sarah and I prepared for battle knowing that we had facts and evidence on our side, but also understanding that family relationships would be permanently damaged by the coming revelations. The decision to fight back strategically rather than emotionally was Sarah's idea, and it proved to be the most effective approach for exposing years of family dysfunction and manipulation. Instead of responding to accusations with anger or defensiveness, we decided to present documented facts and let the evidence speak for itself. My first step was creating a comprehensive timeline of events that included dates, amounts, and supporting documentation for everything that had happened over the past 3 years. The timeline began with my emergency surgery and included medical bills, payment records, bank statements showing my financial struggle, and social media posts that proved my parents' luxury spending during my crisis. The medical documentation was particularly powerful evidence. Hospital records showed the severity of my condition and the emergency nature of the surgery. Insurance statements revealed the exact amounts that I had been responsible for paying. Bank records tracked the depletion of my savings account and the sale of my car. Credit card statements documented the high-interest loans I had taken to cover medical expenses. Parallel to my financial records, I created a timeline of my parents' spending during the same period. The $40,000 RV purchase was documented through state registration records and Frank's own social media posts. Carol's designer shopping trips were immortalized in her Facebook photos with price tags visible on luxury handbags and jewelry. The European cruise was extensively documented through Madison's Instagram account, complete with posts about expensive shore excursions and luxury accommodations. Sarah's background as a nurse proved invaluable in helping relatives understand the medical context of my crisis. She was able to explain in clinical terms how serious peritonitis could be, how emergency surgery was not an elective procedure, and how the timing of my parents' refusal to help could have been literally life-threatening. Her professional credibility gave weight to our narrative in ways that my emotional appeals never could have achieved. Uncle Pete became our most important ally in the Truth campaign. Pete had been present at the hospital during my surgery, though he had arrived after my parents had already left. He remembered the timeline of events, the severity of my condition, and the callous way Frank and Carol had dismissed the medical emergency as a financial inconvenience rather than a family crisis. More importantly, Pete had witnessed conversations between Frank and Carol during family gatherings where they had discussed their version of events. Pete revealed that my parents had been telling different stories to different family members, adjusting their narrative based on their audience and trying to maintain their reputation while avoiding responsibility for their behavior. The revelation about inconsistent stories prompted other family members to compare notes and question what they had been told. Aunt Helen discovered that Carol had told her I was too proud to accept help, while telling my grandmother that I had specifically asked them not to contribute money because I wanted to handle everything myself. Uncle Rob learned that Frank had claimed my insurance covered almost everything while telling my cousin David that the medical bills were much smaller than they actually were. My cousin Amy, who was Madison's maid of honor and closest friend, became an unexpected source of information about the wedding planning process. Amy had been present for conversations where Madison had talked about my supposed contribution to her wedding fund, and she had been confused about why Madison seemed so confident about money that had never been promised or confirmed. According to Amy, Madison had been making expensive decisions and booking premium services based on her assumption that I would cover the costs. She had upgraded everything from the flowers to the photography package, always justifying the additional expenses by saying that her generous brother was covering the difference. Madison had created a fantasy narrative about family support that had no basis in reality. The wedding vendor situation was more complicated than anyone had realized. Patricia from Barton Creek Country Club revealed that Frank and Carol had signed contracts promising payment schedules that they could not meet, and they had specifically told her that additional funds were coming from family members. Several other vendors had similar stories about confident promises backed by non-existent money. Derek's reaction to learning the truth about wedding funding was both predictable and revealing. Instead of supporting Madison through a difficult family situation or offering to modify their plans to accommodate available resources, Derek began questioning whether he wanted to marry into such a dysfunctional family. His social media posts about marrying into wealth and generosity disappeared, replaced by vague comments about the importance of financial stability in relationships. The most powerful moment in our Truth campaign came when I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martinez, the surgeon who had performed my emergency appendectomy 3 years earlier. Dr. Martinez had been following up on a research study about patient outcomes and had called to ask about my recovery experience. During our conversation, he mentioned how unusual it had been for parents to leave the hospital without discussing payment options or showing concern for their child's condition. Dr. Martinez's professional perspective on my parents' behavior was devastating to their claims of caring family values. As a surgeon who had worked with thousands of families during medical crises, he could identify abnormal behavior patterns that might not be obvious to people outside the healthcare system. His willingness to provide a statement about what he had observed during my hospitalization gave our Truth campaign medical authority and professional validation. The financial consultant Robert, who had helped me rebuild my credit and establish long-term financial stability, provided another layer of credibility to our evidence. Robert was able to explain how medical debt typically affects young adults, how unusual it was for parents to completely abandon their child during such a crisis, and how my recovery demonstrated exceptional financial discipline and responsibility. Robert's analysis of my current financial situation also revealed how unrealistic my parents' demands actually were. While I was earning a good salary and had achieved financial stability, contributing $55,000 to Madison's wedding would require depleting my emergency fund, taking on new debt, and potentially jeopardizing the financial security I had worked so hard to rebuild. The Truth campaign reached its climax when I decided to host a family gathering specifically to present all the evidence and documentation we had assembled. I invited everyone who had been drawn into the conflict, including extended family members who had been pressuring me to comply with my parents' demands. I also invited Derek's parents, who deserved to understand the true financial situation before their son married into our dysfunctional family. The dinner invitation was carefully worded to sound like a peaceful family meeting to resolve wedding funding questions, but Sarah and I had prepared a comprehensive presentation that would reveal 3 years of lies, manipulation, and financial irresponsibility. We had documentation to support every claim, witnesses to verify key events, and professional opinions to provide context for family behavior patterns. Uncle Pete agreed to host the gathering at his house, providing neutral territory where Frank and Carol could not control the environment or manipulate the conversation. Pete's military background and natural authority made him an ideal mediator for what we knew would be a difficult and emotional confrontation. The stage was set for a family reckoning that would either force accountability and honest communication or permanently fracture relationships that had been built on lies and favoritism. Sarah and I prepared for every possible response, from denial and deflection to anger and retaliation, knowing that the truth would finally be revealed regardless of how my parents chose to react. The family dinner at Uncle Pete's house was scheduled for a Sunday evening in late April, exactly 1 month before Madison's supposed dream wedding. The timing was deliberate, close enough to the event that everyone would feel the urgency of resolving the financial crisis, but far enough away that alternative solutions could still be implemented if people were willing to face reality. Uncle Pete's dining room had never hosted such a tense gathering. The long wooden table that usually showcased Pete's wife's homemade Sunday dinners was now covered with manila folders containing 3 years of documentation. Sarah and I arrived early to organize our evidence while Pete briefed his wife, Martha, on what was about to unfold in their home. Frank and Carol arrived fashionably late, as always, with Madison and Derek trailing behind them, looking nervous and confused. They had been told this was a family meeting to discuss wedding logistics, and Madison was clearly expecting some kind of intervention that would pressure me into compliance with their financial demands. Derek kept checking his phone, probably hoping to document family drama for his social media accounts. The extended family members arrived in clusters: Aunt Helen with her husband Robert, my cousins Amy and David with their spouses, my grandmother Dorothy, who had driven 3 hours to attend, and Derek's parents, Elizabeth and Michael, who had been invited specifically to witness the financial revelations that would affect their son's marriage. Uncle Pete called for everyone's attention and explained that Jaden had requested the opportunity to address family concerns about Madison's wedding funding. The room fell silent as Pete handed me a stack of documents and nodded for me to begin what would become the most important presentation of my life. I started with the medical timeline displaying hospital bills and insurance statements that showed the exact costs of my emergency surgery. The numbers were stark and undeniable: $32,000 in total expenses, with my insurance covering approximately $19,000, leaving me responsible for over $13,000 in medical debt. Grandmother Dorothy gasped audibly when she saw the documentation. She had been told that my medical emergency was minor and that insurance had covered almost everything. The revelation that her grandson had nearly died from peritonitis while facing financial ruin was clearly shocking and heartbreaking for her. Next came the bank statements showing the depletion of my savings account and the sale of my car. The timeline was brutal in its clarity: savings account balance dropping from $15,000 to zero in a single transaction, car title transfer for $8,000, followed by months of minimum wage freelance work and high-interest loan applications. But the most powerful evidence was the parallel timeline of my parents' spending during my medical crisis. Frank's social media post about the new RV was dated exactly 6 days after my surgery complete, with excited captions about their dream vacation home and comments about finally being able to afford the lifestyle we deserve. The room's energy shifted dramatically as family members realized they had been manipulated and lied to for 3 years. Aunt Helen, who had left harsh voicemails calling me selfish, stared at Frank and Carol with growing anger and disbelief. Cousin David, who had lectured me about family loyalty, was visibly calculating the mathematics of my parents, choosing a luxury RV over their son's medical emergency. Uncle Pete's moment came when Frank tried to interrupt the presentation with deflection and excuses. Pete stood up slowly, his military bearing commanding immediate respect, and announced that he had been present at the hospital during my surgery. His voice was steady and authoritative as he described watching Frank and Carol walk away when the billing coordinator approached them, abandoning their critically ill son to face financial ruin alone. "I have seen combat in Vietnam," Pete said quietly, "and I have never witnessed anything as cold as watching Frank and Carol choose money over their son's life. They bought a $40,000 toy while Jaden was eating ramen noodles and working 3 jobs to pay for emergency surgery that saved his life." The silence that followed Pete's statement was deafening. Frank's face was red with anger and embarrassment, while Carol had started crying the manipulative tears she used whenever her behavior was challenged. Madison looked genuinely shocked, apparently learning for the first time about the severity of my medical crisis and our parents' abandonment during my darkest period. Derek's parents exchanged meaningful glances as they processed the financial irresponsibility and family dysfunction they were witnessing. Elizabeth, the real estate attorney, was clearly calculating the legal and ethical implications of the financial manipulation my parents had attempted. Michael was studying Derek's face, probably wondering if their son understood what kind of family he was planning to marry into. The wedding funding revelation was the final devastating blow to Frank and Carol's credibility. I presented contracts from Barton Creek Country Club showing that my parents had committed to a $75,000 wedding while having only $20,000 available to pay for it. They had signed legally binding agreements based on their assumption that they could pressure me into covering the difference. Madison's reaction was the most heartbreaking part of the entire confrontation. She had genuinely believed that her parents had the financial resources to provide her dream wedding, and she had been making decisions based on confident promises that were never realistic. The revelation that her parents had been planning to manipulate me into funding her wedding was a betrayal that cut deeper than any family argument. Derek's response was swift and predictable. He announced that he needed time to think about whether he wanted to marry into a family with such serious financial and ethical problems. His social media posts about marrying into wealth and generosity had been based on lies, and he was clearly concerned about how the family dysfunction would reflect on his own image and future prospects. But the real transformation began when Madison approached me privately after the formal presentation. She was crying genuine tears of remorse and embarrassment as she apologized for believing our parents' lies and for pressuring me to fund her wedding. She admitted that she had never understood the severity of my medical crisis or the extent of my financial sacrifice during recovery. Madison's apology was the first crack in the wall of family dysfunction that had been built over years of favoritism and financial manipulation. She asked if there was any way to have a smaller, more affordable wedding that would still be meaningful and special. She wanted to know if I would be willing to help her plan something realistic within her actual budget, rather than the fantasy wedding that had been promised with non-existent money. My response surprised everyone, including myself. I told Madison that I would be willing to contribute $5,000 toward a modest wedding celebration, but only if she took complete responsibility for planning and budgeting within realistic means. I would also help her find affordable vendors and negotiate reasonable prices using the business skills I had developed during my own financial recovery. The compromise solution taught Madison valuable lessons about financial responsibility while still providing family support for her major life event. She learned to research vendor prices, compare options, and make decisions based on available resources rather than fantasy budgets. The process of planning a realistic wedding brought us closer together as siblings for the first time in years. Frank and Carol were forced to confront the consequences of years of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation. Extended family members who had previously respected their authority now questioned every story they told and every request they made. Their credibility was permanently damaged, and their ability to manipulate family relationships through lies and favoritism was effectively ended. The most satisfying outcome was the transformation in family dynamics that followed the truth. Revelations. Relatives who had been pressuring me to comply with unrealistic demands apologized for believing my parents' lies and acknowledged that they should have investigated the situation more carefully before taking sides. Grandmother Dorothy was particularly vocal in her support, announcing that she had established a small emergency fund specifically to help family members during genuine medical or financial crises. She made it clear that the fund was designed to prevent anyone from facing the kind of abandonment I had experienced during my surgery recovery. Derek's parents decided to contribute $10,000 toward the wedding, not because they felt obligated to rescue Madison from her parents' poor planning, but because they respected the maturity and responsibility she demonstrated during the budget planning process. Elizabeth specifically mentioned that watching Madison learn to work within realistic financial constraints had convinced them that she might be a positive influence on their son's development. The wedding that eventually took place was beautiful in ways that the original extravagant plan never could have achieved. Madison and Derek were married in Uncle Pete's backyard, with family members contributing flowers from their gardens, homemade food for the reception, and personal talents for music and photography. The total cost was less than $8,000, but the celebration was filled with genuine love and family support that money could never buy. Sarah and I got married 6 months later in a ceremony that reflected our values and priorities. We invited people who had supported us through difficult times, rather than those who demanded compliance with unrealistic expectations. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who had fed me during my financial struggles, sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and crying happy tears throughout the ceremony. The life lesson that emerged from this 3-year journey was profound and lasting. Standing up for yourself does not mean cutting off love or abandoning family relationships. It means demanding respect, honesty, and genuine care rather than accepting manipulation and conditional approval. True family support involves being present during difficult times and celebrating authentic successes, not exploiting relationships for personal gain or convenience. My relationship with Madison grew stronger through honest communication and mutual respect, rather than financial transactions and guilt manipulation. She learned to appreciate genuine family support while taking responsibility for her own decisions and their consequences. Frank and Carol were forced to confront their behavior patterns and begin the difficult process of earning back trust and respect they had squandered through years of favoritism and manipulation. Most importantly, Sarah and I built our marriage on a foundation of authentic partnership and mutual support that had been tested through real hardship. We understood that love means standing beside each other through medical emergencies and financial crises, not abandoning each other when support requires sacrifice or inconvenience. The emergency fund that Sarah and I established together was not just about money. It was about creating security and peace of mind that would allow us to help others during their times of need. We had learned that true financial stability comes not from accumulating wealth for its own sake, but from building resources that can be used to support family and friends through genuine crises. 3 years after my emergency surgery nearly killed me and destroyed my financial life, I had achieved something more valuable than money: a chosen family of people who valued honesty, integrity, and genuine care over manipulation and conditional approval. The medical crisis that had revealed my parents' dysfunction had also shown me the difference between people who abandon you during hardship and those who stand beside you through whatever life brings. The $55,000 that my parents had demanded for Madison's wedding would have perpetuated a cycle of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail that could have continued for decades. By refusing to enable their irresponsible behavior and demanding accountability for their actions, I had created space for honest relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for dysfunctional family members is to refuse to participate in their manipulation and force them to confront the consequences of their behavior. The truth campaign that had seemed so risky and confrontational had actually created opportunities for genuine healing and authentic relationships that would have been impossible while living under lies and favoritism. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that my parents' abandonment during my medical emergency had been a terrible gift that taught me who I could really count on during life's most difficult moments. Sarah, Uncle Pete, Mrs. Patterson, and other genuine supporters had shown me what family really means. Not shared DNA or social obligations, but people who choose to stand beside you when standing beside you requires sacrifice and commitment. The wedding funding crisis had been my opportunity to break the cycle of dysfunction and establish healthy boundaries that would protect my future family from years of manipulation and conditional love. By fighting back with truth and demanding authentic relationships, I had created space for Madison to grow into a more responsible person, while forcing my parents to confront behavior patterns that had damaged their relationships with both of their children. The greatest victory was not financial or social, but personal. I had learned to value my own worth and demand treatment that reflected genuine care, rather than accepting whatever scraps of attention my parents chose to offer. The young man who had been abandoned during emergency surgery had grown into someone who would never again confuse manipulation with love or accept conditional approval as a substitute for authentic family support. What challenges have you faced with family expectations around money, and how did you handle the pressure to sacrifice your own financial security for others? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who is struggling with similar family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building healthy relationships. Share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of standing up for yourself while maintaining compassion for others. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize that you deserve relationships built on genuine love and respect, rather than manipulation and conditional approval. Remember that true family support means being there during the hard times, not just demanding sacrifice when it is convenient for others.